Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, December 20th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Georgia and why I personally believe the Republican Party should be worried about the future of this state as we head into 2024 and many elections beyond the upcoming presidential one. Now, in the 2022 Senate elections, Raphael Warnock won against Herschel Walker in a December 5th runoff by about 2 percentage points across the state, rounding up to 3 points. This victory was a big one for the Democratic Party, considering that they weren't necessarily poised to win in Georgia going into November. The state itself had been a state that had recently given them victories in the 2020 presidential election and in the 2021 runoff elections, but beyond that, Georgia had always been a red state. Democrats hadn't captured it for the presidency since 1992, and when Joe Biden did, it was a big showing that Georgia was on track to be this newfound competitive battleground state, one that Democrats were going to have a realistic shot at victory in the future in many, many elections beyond. But when 2022 rolled around, the expectations were quite grim for the Democratic Party. There were many expectations that Herschel Walker would end up winning, despite allegations that came against Herschel Walker, scandals that plagued his campaign that ultimately were supposed to tank him. But by the time we reached November, on Election Day, Herschel Walker was leading in every single poll but one, which showed a tie between the two candidates. On average, Walker was up 1.4%, and what we know from polling in Georgia is that it historically has been very, very accurate, off by no more than a point in the past 3 elections in the most competitive races, whether that be Georgia's governor this time around, or Senate in 2020, or 2021, or the presidential, or the governor in 2018. Regardless of where you looked, Georgia had always been accurately predicted by the polls, and when they said Walker was up by 1.4%, it was hard to argue with that. But they ended up being wrong by just over 2 points in a way that Warnock ended up in the lead on election night. And as many other Democratic candidates experienced throughout the evening, they had such a tremendous victory across the United States. Democrats were able to really outshine the expectations that were put onto them leading into election night. In fact, expanding their Senate majority around 1 a.m., Pennsylvania went to the Democratic Party. John Fetterman defeated Mehmet Oz. In Arizona, a few days later, Mark Kelly declared the victor in that state. In Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto defeated Adam Laxalt, the former attorney general in that state. In practically every single competitive race, Democrats outperformed expectations. In Wisconsin, they lost by just 1 point. They were on track to lose by 4 to 5 points. In North Carolina, what we found here, that's not North Carolina, Ted Budd won by about 4 points. He was on track to win by 6 or 7 according to the polls. So what we saw on election night was a shift, a tremendous one in favor of the Democratic Party. They locked down Colorado. Democrats thought this might be a sleeper. Republicans were hopeful that it would be, ended up being dead wrong. A 15-point margin for Michael Bennet, an improvement off of Joe Biden back in 2020, an improvement off of many of their 2020 margins of victory. You find this to be the case in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire. Across the United States, Democrats on the standard front did a lot better. And the fact is that Georgia was one of those states. Now, on that basis alone, you might be able to say, okay, you can make that argument for a number of states, that Republicans should be worried about the future of Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Colorado, Arizona, and Georgia. And I think the argument is fair for Arizona, but it requires a little bit more discussion because there's more factors at play than what I think impacts Georgia, or not necessarily more factors, but different factors, right? But specifically in Georgia, this is a state where realistically it should not have been such a good victory for Warnock in this runoff or even in the regular election. What we know about Georgia is that there was a coinciding governor's race, one that Republicans tremendously benefited from, where we saw Brian Kemp win his re-election bid by about 8 points across the state. Now, the reason why this is important is because the fundamental difference between Georgia and some of these other battleground states is that in their coinciding elections, the Democrats did quite well in the other states. Katie Hobbs won in Arizona. You saw a significant narrowing up in New Hampshire relative to the 2020 margin for Democrats in that state. You saw Democrats winning in Colorado by roughly the same amount. But in Georgia, you saw a very, very stark contrast where Brian Kemp was winning by about 8 to 9 points across the state, while Democrats were nearing 50% on the Senate map, which meant there absolutely were voters out there that chose Brian Kemp over Stacey Abrams, but chose Raphael Warnock over Herschel Walker. They weren't Republican through and through voters, as they might have been in years past. And that was good news for the Democratic Party, at least on the front of the Senate. Not so much on the governor's side, but it showed that even with a dominating figure on the GOP side, Brian Kemp, a pretty popular governor for a swing state who was really driven up in terms of popularity for his refusal to overturn the 2020 election results, his refusal to cave into President Trump, I think swung over some Democrats, some independents in the metro Atlanta area that didn't see Stacey Abrams as the future of their state, but rather saw Brian Kemp, a continuation of the same, as the future. And he won them over by a pretty significant amount. I mean, there were, again, a lot of voters here that voted for Biden, voted for Warnock, that also voted for Kemp. And I think that's where really fundamentally was the problem for Stacey Abrams, but ultimately showed just how poor of a showing Herschel Walker had in the regular election. He could not even be carried across the finish line by the best performing Georgia Republican in a few elections now. Even with the polls on his side, Herschel Walker could not crack 50%. And in fact, not only could not crack 50%, but was under 50% and losing to Raphael Warnock. This jumps a stark contrast to what we saw in the last election, that being the 2020 regular election. Now, the reason why I use Perdue and Ossoff is because while it isn't the same case with Raphael Warnock, because he's not the candidate on here, there was an open primary in the Georgia runoff election, a Georgia special election, where Warnock was getting 32% of the vote, as a bunch of scattered Democrats and Republicans. Ultimately, the combined vote share in that election had Republicans up by about 1 to 2 points, but would actually display this a little bit more effectively because it was around the same, would be this initial result where Shane Hazel, the libertarian, prevented David Perdue from reaching that over 50% mark, which meant that this race was heading to a runoff. David Perdue was at 49.7% of the vote. 49.7%. He was so exceptionally close to victory, and if this was any other state, he would have won. He would have won by just under 2 points. But because of laws Georgia had imposed in the past, the Democratic Party was able to head to a runoff, and Jon Ossoff won a lot of those undecided voters, a lot of those libertarian voters, and many Republicans decided to stay home because they didn't think the race was either one, secure and safe, or two, worth voting in, considering the Democrats had practically won every other chamber and a bunch of other competitive seats, and the presidency, which is the most important thing. But with David Perdue being at 49.7%, I think it illustrates that at least in 2020, the Republicans still very much had the overall advantage when it came down to the first round of vote. They were still in the plurality. And I think that shows us that there is a base here for the GOP that they could have relied on for 2022. We knew how competitive this runoff election was in 2021, and there was no chance, at least in our eyes, that Democrats were going to win it again, at least at the initial front. But then the Republicans nominated Herschel Walker. He was a worse candidate than Kelly Loeffler, as the margin will show. And I think that's something that really changed our level of thinking. But had this been, let's say, Brian Kemp or Doug Collins or Brad Raffensperger or another semi-popular Republican or an electable one, might I say, the Republican Party would have done a lot better. And I think our analysis of the race would be a lot different. But still, it stands because the margin was not only maintained, but improved upon. And I think there's a very clear answer as to why this happens. Because Metro Atlanta's population continues to grow and grow and grow. And with that growth come in minority voters, demographic groups that Democrats typically do well in. And I think if we can see this displayed effectively, we can look at the difference between the 2020 census and the 2010 and 2020 census. Both of them done in the state of Georgia, 10 years apart. What do we find as the most important differences? Well, the non-Hispanic white population has dropped from 55.9% to 50.1%. I assume by the next census that white voters and white citizens in Georgia will no longer be the majority. Amongst black residents, 32.6% now, 30.5% before. Knowing how close these races have been, knowing how close the presidential was, that's a very important factor too. Joe Biden won out of 5 million votes here by 11,000 across the state, so I think that also is something to notice. Asian American voters, 4.4% now, 3.2% before. Why is that important? Well, if you look at the runoff election in 2021, the interesting thing here is that Asian American turnout was actually higher in the runoff than in the general election. So if that tells you a lot, it should, because of the fact that that means that those very minimal vote differences could have been made up by an improvement amongst a certain demographic group, or was made by the improvement in turnout by a certain demographic group, that demographic group being Asian Americans. And you can see amongst the Hispanic or Latino population, 10.5% versus 8.8%. So really what we are taking away from this is that the numbers, quite frankly, have improved for Democrats. The demographics have improved for Democrats, and it's something that Democrats are going to utilize and likely do well in the future with, because of the fact that it is a continuous trend. It isn't just this 10-year difference that has halted and now there's no more growth. Metro Atlanta is growing as one of the biggest population centers in the entire country. And you can see this in terms of overall expectations as well. I mean, you can take Fulton County in the 2020 presidential because, to be fair, I would say actually let's compare it to the runoff election. Maybe that's a little bit better because turnout was roughly similar. But in Fulton County, Warnock was receiving around 350,000 votes in the initial runoff. Then in 2022, we received about 280,000 in that runoff election. It was a lower turnout election. The stakes weren't as high. It didn't determine the balance of power. But I want us to also take a look at what these margins are telling us too. Because this improvement in the Metro Atlanta area over just the past 2 years has resulted in an improvement in margin as well. The raw vote share numbers are decreased because of turnout, but still you can see the super large sum that Warnock was receiving in these regions. But in Fulton County in 2021, just a year and a half before the Georgia runoff, when Warnock was winning by around the same across the state, Warnock was up 73-27 in Fulton County. In the 2022 race, it was 77-23. In DeKalb County, we found here that Warnock is at 87-13. Well, in 2021, it was 84-16. This was against Kelly Loeffler, one I would say somehow was a better candidate than Herschel Walker. But given the circumstances, what we have seen here was a very tremendous showing for Warnock. But we can't ignore the fact that demographics played a huge role in it, and the growth of the area has played a tremendous role as well. You can see, again, the Atlanta metro area, Cobb County, neighboring to, right here, Fulton County, 60-40. Well, back in 2021, it was 57-43. And even then, all of this was a tremendous shift in favor of the Democratic Party. We can see here the shift from November in this runoff election. Well, guess what? Almost every single county shifted to the left. Well, you look at 2020, a lot of counties shifted to the right, but that Atlanta metro area, that pesky Atlanta metro area that Republicans can't seem to keep hold of, have shifted tremendously. Rockdale, 10 points more Democratic. Henry County, 12 points more Democratic. Douglas County, 8 points. Cobb County, 5 points. All of these counties in the Atlanta metro area shifted tremendously to the left, counteracting the rightward shift in some of these more rural areas where you have seen a decrease, and a consistent one, in Democratic vote share election after election after election, and yet this area is combating practically all of that and preventing Republicans from winning in the state of Georgia, and that will continue for many years on. As we look ahead to 2024 with a potential rematchup of President Trump and President Biden, Georgia will become a more, a more solid state, I would argue, for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden has work to do. His approval rating is still in the negatives. He's down by about 8 to 9 points nationwide. He's not exactly doing as well as he should be. But that isn't to say that Georgia isn't willing to vote for Democrats when they don't exactly approve of them across the country. Georgia went to Raphael Warnock despite his approval rating still being high, but still iffy, with Biden being down below. And one thing we know about midterms is that it is almost always, because it wasn't in this case, a pushback on the president of the United States. But that did not happen in this midterm election. There was not this complete and total pushback on President Biden, but rather an improvement for Democrats in many of these races, wins in many of the competitive House races, but specifically in Georgia. We have found the Democrats to perform quite well across the state, something that the GOP likely is going to have to combat for many, many more years. Because Brian Kemp's victory might be the last major victory for a Republican in Georgia. And it will come to a point where without a popular Republican, the default is that Georgia is a blue state. The 2020 election was a very good showing for Democrats. The fact that Georgia flipped before North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Iowa, all states that Obama had either won once or twice, and yet Georgia, a state that was seemingly out of control or out of reach for the Democrats. Once again, they hadn't won since Bill Clinton's first term, not even his second. His first term, Georgia went blue. And then it took decades, 28 years, for it to return back to the Democratic Party, and it looks like it's here to stay. This isn't to say the Democrats will win it no matter what in 2024. There's a very good shot that they lose it, simply because it is a battleground state. But what we are recognizing now is that given the population growths, given the demographic changes, year after year after year, the environment, the circumstances, the population becomes more beneficial for one party, that party being the Democratic Party. And it becomes more and more difficult to see how Republicans can claw their way back to victory in a state that used to be so solidly Republican. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.